Shame. You're in a meeting. Someone points out a mistake in your presentation. It's minor, fixable in seconds. But something else happens. Your chest tightens, heat floods your face. And suddenly it's not about the error anymore. It's about you. The thought arrives fast and certain, there's something fundamentally wrong with who I am. This is shame. Not embarrassment over what you did. A collapse of how you see yourself. It doesn't target your actions. It targets your existence. When you feel guilt, you think, I did something bad. When you feel shame, you think, I am bad. That shift changes everything. Guilt points to a behavior you can fix. Shame points to a self you can't escape. It doesn't need logic. A friend cancels plans last minute. Instead of thinking they're busy, you assume you're not worth their time. You stumble over words in conversation. The thought forms instantly, people can see I'm not enough. Shame doesn't argue. It declares. The physical response is unmistakable. Your body wants to disappear. You avoid eye contact. You hunch your shoulders. You make yourself smaller. It's an instinct older than language. The same response animals show when they're signaling submission. Shame makes you want to hide. Not because of what you did, because of what you are, and it spreads. One moment of shame in a meeting becomes proof you don't belong in your career. A single awkward interaction becomes evidence you're socially broken. Shame doesn't stay contained. It pulls in every past failure, every insecurity, every moment you've felt less than. What makes it unbearable is the impossibility of escape. With guilt, you can apologize. Make amends. Change your behavior. But how do you fix yourself when the problem is you? You can't apologize for existing. You can't undo who you are. That's why shame is so destructive. It doesn't just hurt. It erases the possibility of redemption. When the flaw is in your core, when the defect is fundamental, no effort feels like enough. You're not fixing a mistake. You're trying to become a different person entirely. And that feels impossible. Guilt. You snapped at your partner over nothing. You forgot a friend's birthday. You cut someone off in conversation because you were too eager to make your point. The mistake is clear. The regret is immediate. This is guilt. Not a judgment on your existence. A signal that your actions didn't align with your values. It doesn't say you're broken. It says you broke something. And you can repair it. The brain treats guilt as a problem to solve. You replay the moment. You search for what went wrong. You think about what you should have said instead. There's discomfort, yes. But it's the productive kind. Your conscience doing exactly what it's supposed to do, keeping your behavior in check. Guilt pushes you toward action. You send the apology text. You show up with a thoughtful gesture. You commit to doing better next time. The gap between who you are and who you want to be feels fixable. Because it is. The problem isn't you. It's what you did. And that can change. But guilt becomes toxic when it turns chronic. Some people feel guilty for everything. Setting a boundary feels selfish. Saying no feels cruel. Taking time for yourself feels like abandonment. The internal calculation is always the same. If someone else is unhappy, it must be your fault. This is where guilt stops being useful. It's no longer correcting actual wrongs. It's punishing you for things you didn't do. For needs you're allowed to have. For limits that are perfectly reasonable. You apologize when you shouldn't. You sacrifice when it's not required. You carry responsibility that was never yours to begin with. The difference matters. Healthy guilt says, I made a mistake and I'll fix it. Toxic guilt says, everything is my fault and I owe everyone everything. One keeps you accountable. The other keeps you trapped. Guilt, when it works right, is a compass. It tells you when you've wandered off course. Then it points you back. It doesn't destroy your sense of self. It refines it. The sting fades once the repair is made. Once the lesson is learned, what remains isn't shame. It's clarity. Embarrassment. You're telling a story at dinner. Midway through, you realize you've completely forgotten the name of the person you're talking about. Everyone's waiting. You pause, stumble, try to recover. And in that moment, every eye on you feels like a spotlight burning into your skin. That flush of heat. The desperate wish to rewind 5 seconds. That's embarrassment. A flash of social exposure that makes you want to shrink, laugh it off, or change the subject as fast as possible. Embarrassment lives in the gap between how you want to appear and how you actually come across. It's the moment your carefully managed image cracks. Spilling coffee on yourself during a presentation. Waving at someone who wasn't waving at you. Walking into a glass door. Small things, but in the moment they feel huge. What makes embarrassment bearable is its brevity. It spikes hard, then fades. You cringe. You laugh about it later. The memory stings for a day, maybe a week, then becomes a funny story you tell at parties. It doesn't rewrite who you are. It's just a moment when the performance slipped. But it does leave a trace. You become hyper-aware of similar situations. You rehearse names before events. You double-check before you wave. Embarrassment trains you to tighten the gap between intention and execution, to smooth over the small ruptures before they happen again. The key difference from shame is this: embarrassment says, "I looked foolish." Shame says, "I am foolish." One is a stumble. The other is a verdict. Embarrassment stings because you care what people think. Shame burns because you've started to believe what you fear they're thinking. And that's why embarrassment, painful as it is, stays manageable. It's not about your core. It's about a moment, and moments pass. Humiliation. Your manager calls you out in front of the entire team. Not for something you did wrong. For something petty. Something that didn't need to be public. But they make it public anyway. They make sure everyone hears. And in that moment, you feel something shift. Not just embarrassment. Something heavier. Something that doesn't fade when the meeting ends. Humiliation isn't just exposure. It's degradation. Someone didn't just point out a mistake. They made you small. On purpose. Embarrassment happens by accident. You trip. You forget a name. No one meant for it to happen. Humiliation is intentional. Someone decided you needed to be put in your place, and they made sure others saw it happen. The damage is in the power imbalance. When someone humiliates you, they're not just correcting you. They're asserting dominance. They're reminding you, and everyone watching, where you stand in the hierarchy. The content of the criticism doesn't even matter. What matters is the performance. The public nature of it. The message it sends. That's why humiliation cuts deeper than embarrassment. You're not just feeling foolish. You're feeling powerless. You can't laugh it off. You can't reframe it as a funny story, because it wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Someone chose to make you feel this way. And the worst part is, it works. You second-guess yourself more. You stay quiet in meetings. You avoid drawing attention. Not because you learned a lesson about the actual mistake, but because you learned a lesson about power. You learned that speaking up, standing out, or challenging the wrong person can get you publicly dismantled. Humiliation doesn't just sting. It trains. It teaches you to make yourself smaller to avoid being made small by someone else. And that lesson doesn't fade when the moment passes. It lingers. It shapes how you show up, how much space you take, how willing you are to risk being seen. Toxic shame. You wake up, and before you've even opened your eyes, the thought is already there. I'm not enough. It's not tied to anything specific. You didn't make a mistake yesterday. No one criticized you. But the feeling is there anyway, solid and familiar, like it's been waiting for you. This is toxic shame. not a reaction to something you did. A baseline, a lens you see yourself through, no matter what's actually happening. Healthy shame is situational. You violate a value, feel the discomfort, and course correct. It's a signal. Toxic shame is identity. It doesn't need a trigger. It's just there, humming quietly in the background, convincing you that no matter what you do, you'll never measure up. Where does it come from? Usually early. Repeated messages that you're not good enough. Parents who withheld approval unless you were perfect. Environments where love felt conditional. Mistakes that were treated as moral failures instead of learning moments. Over time, those external judgments become internal. You stop needing someone else to tell you you're inadequate. You tell yourself. And toxic shame is exhausting. Because there's no fixing it. With guilt, you make amends. With embarrassment, you move on. But toxic shame isn't about what you did. It's about what you are. And you can't apologize your way out of that. You can't make amends for existing. So instead, you compensate. You overwork. You people please. You avoid anything that might expose the inadequacy you're sure is there. You curate your life around hiding the flaw you believe defines you. Not because anyone's asking you to. Because the shame demands it. The cruelty of toxic shame is that it's self-sustaining. Every success gets reframed as luck. Every failure gets filed as proof. You can't win. The shame doesn't care what you accomplish. It's already made up its mind about who you are. And breaking free doesn't happen by trying harder. It happens by recognizing that the voice saying you're not enough isn't truth. It's a recording. One that's been playing so long you forgot it wasn't yours. Vicarious embarrassment. Someone's giving a toast at a wedding. They're a little drunk, a little too confident. They make a joke that doesn't land. Then another. The room goes quiet. They keep going, oblivious, and you feel your stomach tighten. You're not the one talking, but somehow you're the one cringing. This is vicarious embarrassment, the discomfort you feel watching someone else's social misstep. You're safe. You're not exposed. But your body reacts like you are. Why does this happen? Because humans are wired to simulate what others are experiencing. It's called empathic resonance. When you see someone trip, your brain briefly fires the same motor patterns as if you tripped. When you see someone embarrassed, your brain mirrors that feeling, even though you're not the target. But vicarious embarrassment goes deeper than just empathy. It's tied to social learning. Watching someone else violate a norm teaches you where the boundaries are without having to cross them yourself. Your discomfort is your brain cataloging the mistake and filing it under things to avoid. Debt. That's why it's so intense with people you identify with. If the person at the microphone is close to your age, your profession, your background, the mirror effect strengthens. You can imagine yourself in their position too easily. The boundary between their failure and your potential failure feels thin. And here's the strange part: vicarious embarrassment can be stronger than your own. When you embarrass yourself, you have context. You know your intentions. You can rationalize. But when you watch someone else, you only see the external performance. You can't access their internal justification. So the cringe hits harder. It's why you look away during awkward scenes in movies. Why you mute the TV when someone's about to humiliate themselves on a reality show. Your brain doesn't care that it's fictional. It's registering social danger. And it wants out. Vicarious embarrassment isn't weakness. It's proof that you're paying attention, that you're learning, that you care about social cohesion enough to feel the cost of violating it, even when the violation isn't yours. Moral injury. You followed the rules. You did what you were told. And someone got hurt because of it. Not because you wanted to harm them. Because the system you trusted, the authority you followed, led you to do something that violates every value you thought you stood for. This is moral injury. The wound that opens when your actions betray your conscience, even when you had no choice. It's different from guilt. Guilt says, I made the wrong choice. Moral injury says, I was put in a situation where every choice was wrong. You didn't fail morally. The situation itself was impossible, but your hands still did the thing. And now you have to live with that. Veterans describe it most clearly. Following orders that resulted in civilian deaths. Watching fellow soldiers die because command made the wrong call. Being forced to choose between loyalty to your unit and what you knew was right. The injury isn't just in what happened. It's in the realization that the institution you believed in, the mission you trusted, made you complicit in something you can't reconcile. But it's not just war. Healthcare workers forced to ration care, knowing some patients will die because of decisions they have no control over. Teachers required to enforce policies they know harm students. Employees told to carry out layoffs that destroy families' livelihoods. The structure demands it. You comply? And the moral cost lands on you anyway. Moral injury doesn't heal like guilt. You can't apologize your way out. You can't make amends. Because the wrong wasn't yours alone. It was systemic. You were a participant, yes. But you were also a tool. And that ambiguity, that impossibility of clear blame, makes the wound harder to close. What stays is the fracture. The split between who you thought you were and what you were made to do. You can't undo it. You can't unsee it. You can only carry it and figure out how to rebuild a sense of self that can hold both the person you wanted to be and the actions you were forced to take. Shame spiral. One negative thought. That's all it takes. You make a small mistake at work. A reasonable person would shrug it off, but you don't. You think, I always mess things up. Then the thought expands. People must think I'm incompetent. Then it goes deeper. I don't deserve this job. And before you know it, you're convinced you're a fraud who's fooled everyone into thinking you're capable. This is the shame spiral. A single moment of self-criticism that triggers a cascade, pulling in every failure, every insecurity, every doubt you've ever had about yourself. It doesn't stop at the mistake. It rewrites your entire identity. The mechanics are brutal. Shame activates the same threat detection systems in the brain as physical danger. Your body floods with stress hormones. Your thinking narrows. And in that narrowed state, your mind doesn't look for evidence that contradicts the shame. It looks for evidence that confirms it. So one mistake becomes proof of a pattern. I always do this. One awkward interaction becomes proof you're socially broken. No one actually likes me. One rejection becomes proof you're fundamentally unlovable. I'll always be alone. The spiral doesn't need new information. It feeds on what's already there, twisting it into a story of deficiency. And the worst part, the spiral feels logical. In the moment, each thought seems like a natural conclusion. The evidence seems overwhelming. You're not catastrophizing. You're finally seeing the truth everyone else has been too polite to say. But you're not. You're in a cognitive loop where shame is both the lens and the conclusion. It selects the memories. It interprets the facts. And it makes sure everything points back to the same verdict. You're not enough. Breaking the spiral doesn't happen by arguing with the thoughts. It happens by recognizing the pattern. When one thought about a specific action becomes a global statement about who you are, that's the signal. The spiral has started. And the only way out is to step back, name it, and refuse to follow it down. Guilt-Proneness. You cancel plans because you're exhausted. The friend says it's fine. But you spend the rest of the night replaying the conversation, convinced you've let them down. You take a sick day. Your coworker has to cover. Even though that's how sick days work, you feel like you've burdened them. You set a boundary. Someone's disappointed. And immediately, you wonder if you made a mistake. This is guilt-proneness. Not feeling guilty when you've actually done something wrong. Feeling guilty for existing with needs, limits, and preferences. People high in guilt-proneness are hyper-aware of their impact on others. It's not selfishness. It's the opposite. They're so tuned into how their actions might inconvenience, disappoint, or upset someone that they preemptively carry the weight of it. Even when there's nothing to apologize for. Where does it come from? Often environments where other people's comfort mattered more than your own. Families where expressing a need was met with guilt-tripping. Relationships where disappointing someone, even reasonably, meant punishment. Over time, the lesson sinks in your needs are a burden. And the only way to be acceptable is to minimize them. So you overfunction. You say yes when you mean no. You prioritize everyone else's comfort over your own rest. You apologize for things that don't require apologies. Not because you're weak. Because you've been trained to believe that taking up space is inherently selfish. But guilt-proneness has a cost. You exhaust yourself trying to make everyone happy. You resent people for asking things of you, even though they're asking reasonably, because you can't say no without feeling like a bad person. You lose track of what you actually want because you're so focused on what you think you owe. The cruel irony is that guilt-prone people are often the most considerate. They're not selfish. They're hypervigilant about not being selfish. But that hypervigilance doesn't create better relationships. It creates exhaustion and resentment, and a version of yourself that's so small, so apologetic, so careful that you've disappeared. Shame-proneness. You make a joke that doesn't land. Instead of thinking, that was awkward, you think, I'm awkward. You forget to respond to a text. Instead of, I got busy, it's, I'm a terrible friend. The shift is automatic, instant. A single action becomes a statement about who you are. This is shame-proneness. The tendency to interpret mistakes not as things you did, but as proof of what you are. Shame-prone people don't just feel bad about their actions. They globalize. One failure becomes evidence of incompetence. One social misstep becomes proof they're fundamentally unlikable. One moment of weakness becomes confirmation they're broken. It's not situational. It's existential. And it's exhausting, because there's no such thing as a small mistake. Every slip, every awkward moment, every less than perfect interaction gets filed under the same category, proof I'm not good enough. The stakes are always too high. The margin for error is always too thin. Research shows shame-proneness is linked to perfectionism, social anxiety, and depression. It makes sense. If every mistake threatens your entire sense of self, you can't relax. You can't take risks. You can't let yourself be seen as anything less than flawless, because any crack in the performance feels like total collapse. The tragedy is that shame-prone people often hold themselves to standards they'd never apply to anyone else. A friend makes the same mistake. They'd shrug it off, offer reassurance. But when they make it, it's unforgivable. The compassion they extend outward never turns inward. And shame-proneness is self-reinforcing. The more you believe your mistakes define you, the more you avoid situations where mistakes are possible. You stop trying new things. You stay quiet in conversations. You curate your life to minimize exposure. Not because you're lazy, because the cost of being seen as flawed feels unbearable. But here's the pattern: the more you protect yourself from shame, the smaller your world gets. And the smaller your world, the more weight each interaction carries, until the only proof you have of your worth is how perfectly you perform. And that's a game you can't win. Fear of exposure. You're doing well. People respect you. Your work is solid. But underneath, there's a voice that never stops whispering they don't really know you. If they did, if they saw the parts you keep hidden, they'd realize you're not who they think you are. And that realization, the moment the mask slips, feels like the end of everything. This is fear of exposure, the terror that being truly seen means being rejected. It's not about hiding bad behavior. It's about hiding anything that doesn't fit the image you've worked so hard to maintain. The struggle, the uncertainty, the flaws, the fact that you don't have it all figured out, those parts feel too risky to reveal. So you curate, you perform, you keep the messier truths locked down, and it works, until it doesn't. Because maintaining the performance takes energy. You monitor every word, you rehearse conversations. You edit yourself in real time, always calculating, will this make me look weak? Will this make them think less of me? The fear doesn't rest. It just stays there humming in the background, reminding you that one wrong move could unravel everything. The cost is connection. Real intimacy requires being known. But being known means being seen in full. The competent parts and the struggling parts. The confidence and the doubt. When you're terrified of exposure, you can't let anyone close enough to see both. So relationships stay surface level. Friendships feel hollow. You're surrounded by people who like the version you show them, and lonely because that version isn't really you. Here's the trap. The longer you hide, the bigger the gap between who you are and who you present. And the bigger the gap, the more catastrophic exposure feels. So you keep hiding, and the fear grows, and the isolation deepens. Because you're not just afraid people will reject the real you. You're starting to believe the real you deserves to be rejected. But the fear isn't the truth. It's the shame talking, convincing you that being imperfect is the same as being unworthy. That needing help is weakness. That struggle disqualifies you from belonging. And none of that is real. But as long as the fear runs the show, you'll never find out. Public self-consciousness. You walk into a coffee shop. Immediately you're aware of how you're standing, how you're holding your bag, whether your expression looks approachable or awkward. You order, and suddenly you're thinking about your tone. Are you being too friendly? Not friendly enough. You sit down, and you can feel the weight of being watched, even though no one's looking. This is public self-consciousness. The constant, exhausting awareness of yourself as an object of potential judgment. It's not paranoia. It's hypervigilance. Your brain is running a background program, constantly asking, how do I look? How do I sound? What are they thinking? And that program doesn't shut off. It shapes how you move through the world. Every interaction, every public moment, every time you're visible. People high in public self-consciousness aren't vain. They're anxious. They're not thinking, I look great. They're thinking, I look wrong. The awareness isn't about admiration. It's about threat. The fear that someone will notice the flaw, the awkwardness, the thing that marks you as different or inadequate. And it's draining. You can't relax in public. You can't let your guard down. Because the moment you do, the moment you stop monitoring, you risk doing something that draws the wrong kind of attention. So you stay vigilant, you curate, you adjust. And the effort of managing your external presentation leaves you exhausted before the day even starts. What makes it worse is the distortion. Public self-consciousness amplifies perceived flaws. You think everyone's noticing things they're not. That stumble on the stairs. You replay it for hours. That slightly awkward phrase. You're convinced it's all they'll remember. But the truth is, most people aren't paying that much attention. They're too busy managing their own self-consciousness. The tragedy is that public self-consciousness keeps you from being present. You're so focused on how you're being perceived that you miss the actual experience. The conversation. The moment. The connection. You're there, but you're not really there. You're watching yourself be there. And that distance that split is where the loneliness lives. Private self-consciousness. Late at night, when everything's quiet, your mind won't stop. You replay the day, not the highlights. The moments you wish had gone differently. The conversation where you said the wrong thing. The decision you second guess. The feeling you can't quite name but can't shake either. This is private self-consciousness. Not worrying about how others see you. Worrying about how you see yourself. People high in private self-consciousness spend a lot of time inside their own heads. They notice their emotions before they fully surface. They track their thoughts. They analyze their motives. It's not vanity. It's scrutiny, a constant internal audit of whether they're living up to their own standards. And unlike public self-consciousness, which focuses outward, this one turns the lens inward. You're not asking, what do they think of me? You're asking, what do I think of me? The audience is internal, but the judgment is just as harsh. Private self-consciousness can drive growth. It makes you self-aware. It keeps you aligned with your values. You notice when you're drifting. You course correct before the damage spreads. That internal monitoring can be a strength, but it becomes a problem when the monitoring never stops. When every action gets dissected, every motive questioned, every emotion analyzed until it loses meaning. You can't just experience something. You have to understand it, categorize it, decide if it's acceptable. And that distance, that constant stepping back to evaluate, keeps you from actually being present. The exhaustion isn't from feeling too much. It's from thinking about the feeling, processing it, judging it, wondering if you're allowed to feel it or if it means something's wrong with you. The internal dialogue never shuts off, and the more you examine yourself, the more there is to examine. Until you're so tangled in self-reflection that you've lost track of what's actually happening outside your head. Evaluation apprehension. The professor asks if anyone has questions. You have one. A good one. But your hand stays down. Because the moment you think about raising it, the calculations start. What if it's obvious? What if everyone already knows the answer? What if asking makes you look unprepared? This is evaluation apprehension, the fear that any visible action will be judged and found lacking. It's not general anxiety. It's specific. It kicks in when you're being watched, when there's a chance your performance will be measured. A presentation. A meeting where you're expected to contribute. A conversation with someone whose opinion matters. The fear isn't about the task itself. It's about being evaluated while you do it. And it's paralyzing. You know the answer. But you stay quiet because speaking up means being assessed. You have ideas, but you hold back because offering them opens you to criticism. You want to participate, but the risk of looking foolish, incompetent, or wrong feels too high. So you do nothing, and the silence becomes its own failure. Research shows evaluation apprehension worsens performance. Not because people lack ability, because the fear of being judged drains the cognitive resources needed to actually perform well. You're not focused on the task. You're focused on managing the anxiety, and that split attention guarantees the outcome you were trying to avoid. Worse, it's self-reinforcing. You stay silent to avoid judgment, but staying silent means you never get the feedback that could prove the fear wrong. You never discover that most questions aren't as obvious as you think. That most contributions are valued, not torn apart. That the judgment you're terrified of is far less harsh than the judgment you're inflicting on yourself. So the fear persists, and the pattern deepens, until you're not just avoiding evaluation. You're avoiding any situation where evaluation is possible, which means you're avoiding growth, because growth requires being seen. And being seen requires accepting that sometimes you'll be judged, and that has to be okay. Social anxiety. You're invited to a party. Your first thought isn't excitement, it's dread. Not because you don't like people, because being around them feels like walking through a minefield. Every interaction is a test you're convinced you'll fail. Social anxiety isn't shyness. Shy people might feel nervous in new situations but warm up over time. Social anxiety doesn't warm up. It stays sharp and relentless, convinced that every conversation is going wrong even when it's going fine. The fear is specific. You'll say something awkward, do something embarrassing, be exposed as boring, weird, or unlikable. And once that happens, people will reject you. Not subtly. Definitively. The scenario plays out in your head with absolute certainty, even though it almost never happens that way in reality. So you prepare. You rehearse conversation topics. You plan exits. You monitor your body language, your tone, your facial expressions. But the preparation doesn't ease the anxiety. It feeds it. Because the more you try to control the interaction, the more aware you become of everything that could go wrong. And here's the cruel irony: the hypervigilance makes you seem distant. You're so focused on not messing up that you miss the natural flow of conversation. You respond a beat too late because you're analyzing what you should say. You don't make eye contact because you're managing your internal panic. The other person doesn't see someone anxious. They see someone uninterested. And that misread confirms the fear. See, they don't like you. Social anxiety doesn't just make social situations hard. It makes them feel dangerous. Like every gathering is a performance where one misstep will lead to total rejection. And the exhaustion isn't from the event itself. It's from the hours of anticipatory dread beforehand and the hours of post-mortem analysis afterward, replaying every moment, cataloging every mistake, convincing yourself it went worse than it did. The only way out is exposure. Not to prove you can handle it, but to prove the catastrophe you're predicting won't happen. That most people aren't scrutinizing you. That awkward moments pass. That rejection, when it does happen, isn't the end. But when your brain is screaming danger every time you walk into a room, that exposure feels impossible. Rejection sensitivity. A friend takes a few hours to reply to your text. Immediately, your mind fills in the gap. They're annoyed with you. They're pulling away. They don't want to talk anymore. By the time they respond with something casual, you've already written the story. And the story is always the same: you're about to be abandoned. This is rejection sensitivity, not just fearing rejection, expecting it, seeing it everywhere, even when it's not there. People high in rejection sensitivity don't wait for concrete evidence. A delayed response, a short reply, a cancelled plan. Each one gets interpreted as proof that the relationship is ending. The brain doesn't ask, what else could this mean? It jumps straight to, they're done with the tar. Where does it come from? Usually early. Relationships where affection felt conditional. Environments where connection was unstable. People who learned that closeness could vanish without warning. Over time, the lesson solidifies: don't get comfortable. Rejection is always around the corner. So you scan for signs. You overanalyze tone. You read into silences. And when you spot something, anything that could mean rejection, you react. Not proportionally, defensively. You withdraw before they can pull away first. You lash out to test if they'll stay. You demand reassurance, then don't believe it when it's given. Because the sensitivity isn't looking for proof you're safe. It's looking for proof you're right. And that vigilance destroys relationships. Not because people actually want to leave. Because your constant anticipation of rejection creates the distance you're afraid of. You push. You cling. You read malice into neutral behavior, until the other person, exhausted by the instability, actually does pull back. And in your mind, that confirms everything. You weren't paranoid. You were right all along. But you weren't. The rejection you feared didn't exist until your fear created it. And breaking that cycle doesn't mean ignoring the signs. It means questioning the interpretation. Asking, is this rejection? Or is this just life? Because most of the time it's just life. And the catastrophe you're bracing for is one you're writing yourself. self-blame. The project fails. It wasn't just you. The timeline was unrealistic. The budget was cut. Half the team was reassigned mid-process. But when it falls apart, you don't think about those factors. You think, I should have worked harder. I should have seen this coming. I should have done more. Self-blame is the reflex to assign fault inward, no matter the context, no matter the circumstances. If something goes wrong, it must be because you failed. And it's not humility. Humble people can acknowledge mistakes without collapsing into self-recrimination. Self-blame doesn't stop at, I made an error. It goes further. I'm the reason this failed. If I'd been better, smarter, more capable, this wouldn't have happened. The pattern starts early. Children who grow up in unpredictable environments learn to take responsibility for things they can't control. If the adults around them are unstable, the child blames themselves. If I were better, they'd be happier. That logic doesn't make sense. But it gives the child a sense of control. If it's your fault, maybe you can fix it. Except you can't. And the self-blame doesn't lead to solutions. It leads to shame. Because once you've decided everything is your fault, there's no room for nuance. No room for bad luck, systemic failure, or shared responsibility. Just you, failing. Again. Self-blame also protects against a scarier reality, that some things are out of your control. If you accept that external factors matter, you have to accept that effort isn't always enough. That doing everything right doesn't guarantee success. That bad things happen to good people for no reason. And that lack of control is terrifying. So you blame yourself, because if it's your fault, at least there's a story. A reason. A way it could have been different. The alternative, that chaos is real and fairness is a myth, is harder to live with. But the cost of self-blame is steep. You carry weight that isn't yours. You apologize for things you didn't cause. And you exhaust yourself trying to fix problems that were never yours to solve. Overresponsibility. Your coworker is struggling. You step in. Your friend is upset. You drop everything to help. Your family needs something. You rearrange your life to make it happen. Not because anyone asked. Because you've decided that if you don't handle it, it won't get handled. And if it doesn't get handled, it's on you. This is overresponsibility. The belief that you're accountable for outcomes you have no control over. That other people's problems are yours to solve. That if you don't carry the weight, everything will collapse. It starts with good intentions. You're capable. You care. You see a need and you fill it. And at first, it feels right. You're helping. You're needed. You're making a difference. But over time, the boundary between helping and taking over disappears. You're not just supporting. You're managing, fixing, anticipating needs before people even express them. And it's exhausting. Because you can't rest. There's always something else. Someone else who needs you. Another problem to solve. Another fire to put out. You tell yourself you're just being responsible. But responsibility means taking care of what's yours. This is something else. This is taking on everyone else's load and calling it duty. The cost is resentment. You're doing more than your share. And no one asked you to. But you're angry anyway. Angry they're not stepping up. Angry they don't appreciate how much you're carrying. Angry they seem fine while you're drowning. But you can't say that. Because you chose this. You insisted on it. So the resentment stays buried. And the exhaustion compounds. Overresponsibility also robs people of agency. When you step in before they've even tried, you're sending a message. I don't trust you to handle this. You might think you're helping. But what you're doing is taking over. And that doesn't build competence. It builds dependency. Until people stop trying because they know you'll do it anyway. The trap is believing that if you stop, everything falls apart. But that's not true. Most things don't need you the way you think they do. Most people are more capable than you're giving them credit for. And the weight you're carrying, a lot of it was never yours to begin with. But letting go means accepting that you're not indispensable. And for someone who's built their identity around being needed, that feels like disappearing. Moral scrupulosity. Did you check the door? Yes. Did you really check it? You walk back. Check again. Lock engaged. Handle tested. But the doubt returns before you reach the car. What if you only thought you checked? What if the memory is false? You go back. Again. Now replace the door with a moral question. Did that comment hurt someone's feelings? Did you do enough to help? Was that decision selfish? The checking doesn't stop. The doubt doesn't ease. You retrace every action, every word, every thought, searching for proof you haven't crossed an invisible line. This is moral scrupulosity. Obsessive doubt about whether you're being good enough. Not occasionally. Constantly. People with moral scrupulosity don't just have high standards. They have impossible ones. And the brain treats moral uncertainty the way it treats physical threat. It demands resolution. Did you lock the door or not? Are you a good person or not? Except moral questions don't lock. They don't resolve cleanly. So the doubt loops. The checking continues, and the anxiety compounds. It often shows up around religion or ethics. Did you pray correctly? Did you have an impure thought? Did you violate a rule you didn't know existed? The questions feel urgent. Life or death urgent. Not because the stakes are actually that high, but because the brain has categorized moral failure as catastrophic. And checking doesn't help. You confess. You apologize. You ask for reassurance. But the relief lasts minutes. Then the doubt returns. Because the problem isn't the action. It's the uncertainty. And no amount of checking can eliminate uncertainty when the standard is perfection. So you avoid. You don't make decisions because decisions carry moral weight. You don't speak because words might harm. You don't act because action might be wrong. And the avoidance feels safe. But it's not safety. It's paralysis. And the more you avoid, the more the world shrinks. Until you're not living by values. You're imprisoned by them. Thought-action fusion. You have an intrusive thought. A violent one. A sexual one. Something you'd never act on. But the thought showed up. And immediately, your mind equates having the thought with wanting to do it. Or worse, with being the kind of person who would. This is thought-action fusion. The belief that thinking something is morally equivalent to doing it. It operates on two levels. First, moral equivalence. If you think about harming someone, you're as guilty as if you'd actually harmed them. The thought itself is the sin. Second, magical thinking. If you imagine something bad happening, you've increased the likelihood it will. The thought has power, and you're responsible for controlling it. Neither of these beliefs is rational. Thoughts aren't actions. Imagining something doesn't make it happen. But rationality doesn't matter when your brain has fused the two. The guilt lands the same. The fear feels the same. And the compulsion to neutralize the thought, to undo it, becomes overwhelming. So you engage in mental rituals. You replace the bad thought with a good one. You repeat a phrase to cancel it out. You confess even though there's nothing to confess, because the thought feels like evidence of moral corruption. And the rituals provide temporary relief. But they also reinforce the fusion. Because by treating the thought as dangerous, you're confirming that it matters. And the cycle tightens. Thought-action fusion is common in conditions like OCD. But it shows up in everyday guilt too. You think something unkind about a friend. Then you feel like you've betrayed them, even though you didn't say it, didn't act on it, didn't let it influence your behavior. The thought alone feels like a violation. The solution isn't suppression. Trying not to think something guarantees you'll think it more. The solution is separation. Recognizing that thoughts are mental events. They happen. They don't define you. They don't predict your actions. And having one doesn't make you guilty of anything except being human. Survivor guilt. The accident was random. You walked away. They didn't. No logical reason, no fair explanation. Just chance. And now, instead of relief, you feel something else. Something heavier. You shouldn't be here. You should have been the one who didn't make it. Or at the very least, you don't deserve to be okay when they're not. This is survivor guilt. The irrational conviction that surviving when others didn't makes you complicit. Or unworthy. It's not about what you did. You didn't cause the harm. You didn't choose who lived and who died. But guilt doesn't care about logic. It latches onto the fact that you're still here and they're not. And that asymmetry feels wrong. Unfair. Unfair. Like the universe made a mistake and you're the evidence. Survivor guilt shows up in disasters, accidents, combat, illness. Anywhere survival feels arbitrary. You got the treatment that worked. They didn't. You were in a different car, a different building, a different unit. The randomness is unbearable. Because if there's no reason you survived, then survival feels undeserved. And if it's undeserved, enjoying it feels like betrayal. So you don't. You don't celebrate, move forward. You don't allow yourself relief or happiness because they can't have those things. Living fully feels like rubbing it in. So you half live. You carry the weight of their absence like penance, as if suffering enough will balance the scales, but it won't. Survivor guilt isn't about fairness. It's about powerlessness. You couldn't save them. You couldn't control the outcome. And guilt gives you something to hold on to. A story where you matter. Where your survival means something. Even if that something is blame. The cruelty is that survivor guilt punishes you for being alive. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the alternative, accepting that survival is random and meaningless, is too destabilizing to bear. So you carry the guilt, and it becomes a kind of memorial. Proof that you haven't forgotten, that their loss still matters, that you're still connected, even if that connection is built on self-punishment. Collective guilt. You didn't own slaves. You didn't write the laws. You didn't cast the votes. But you benefit from the system that did. The wealth accumulated. The opportunities created. The advantages passed down. And now, when you look at the inequality that system produced, you feel it. Not just awareness. Guilt. This is collective guilt. Feeling responsible for harms committed by the group you belong to. Even when you personally didn't commit them. It's not individual accountability. You didn't do the thing, but your identity is tied to people who did. Your country, your ethnicity, your institution. And the guilt comes from recognizing that the benefits you have, the stability you enjoy, the access you take for granted, are built on harm you didn't inflict but still profit from. Some people reject collective guilt outright. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. Why should I feel guilty? And on one level, they're right. Personal responsibility requires personal action. But collective guilt isn't about personal blame. It's about recognizing complicity. You inherit the system. You participate in it. And even if you didn't create the harm, you're part of the structure that sustains it. The question isn't whether the guilt is fair. It's whether it's useful. Does it motivate action? Does it lead to repair? Or does it just turn into performative self-flagellation that centers your feelings instead of addressing the actual harm? Collective guilt becomes destructive when it stops at feeling bad. When it becomes an identity, I'm one of the good ones because I feel guilty. But guilt without action is just moral theater. It doesn't change systems. It doesn't repair harm. It just makes you feel like you're doing something when you're not. The alternative is responsibility without guilt. Acknowledging the harm, recognizing your position in the system, and acting to change it. Not because you're personally to blame, but because you're here. You have influence, and doing nothing perpetuates what you claim to feel guilty about. That shift from guilt to accountability is where the feeling becomes useful. Until then, it's just weight you carry to prove you care. Existential guilt. You're sitting in a comfortable chair. You've eaten today. You're safe. And somewhere someone isn't. Someone's starving. Someone's dying. Someone's suffering in ways you can't imagine. And you know this. You've always known this. But you're still sitting here. Comfortable. And that gap between your comfort and their suffering feels unbearable. This is existential guilt. Not guilt over something you did. Guilt over the fact that you exist in privilege while others exist in pain. It's the guilt of being okay when the world isn't. Of having enough when others have nothing. Of feeling joy when suffering is constant and widespread. And the guilt doesn't come from action. It comes from inaction. From the fact that you could do more, give more, sacrifice more. And you don't. Existential guilt is totalizing. Because the need is infinite. No matter how much you give, there's always more suffering. No matter how much you sacrifice, it's never enough. You can't fix it. You can't solve it. And that impossibility makes the guilt inescapable. Some people use existential guilt as fuel. They dedicate their lives to service, to activism, to trying to close the gap. But for most people, the guilt just sits there. A low-grade hum. A reminder that your comfort is built on luck. That your safety is circumstantial. That you haven't earned what you have any more than others have earned what they lack. And the guilt can paralyze. If everything you have is undeserved, how do you enjoy it? If your comfort is complicit in others' suffering, how do you relax? The logic leads to a place where living well feels like a moral failure. And the only acceptable response is perpetual self-denial. But that's not sustainable, and it's not helpful, because existential guilt, like collective guilt, becomes destructive when it replaces action. When feeling bad becomes the point. When you carry the weight as proof of your awareness but do nothing with it. The way through isn't to eliminate the guilt. It's to redirect it. Use it as a signal. A reminder that you have capacity, that you're positioned to help, and then act, not to absolve the guilt, but because action is better than inaction, and doing something, even if it's not enough, is better than doing nothing while drowning in the knowledge that you could. Body shame. You're getting dressed. You glance in the mirror, and the first thought isn't neutral. It's critical. Too much here. Not enough there. Wrong shape. Wrong size. The assessment is instant. Automatic. Matic. And it's not just about appearance. It's about worth. This is body shame. The belief that your body, as it is unacceptable. That it marks you as less than. That it's evidence of failure, weakness, or lack of discipline. Body shame doesn't start with you. It's taught. Through media that erases certain bodies, through comments that land and stick, through the message, repeated and reinforced, that your value is tied to how you look. And over time, the external judgment becomes internal. You don't need anyone else to criticize your body. You do it yourself. And it's not about health. Body shame doesn't motivate healthy choices. It motivates hiding. Avoidance. Self-punishment. You skip events because you don't want to be seen. You avoid mirrors. You dress to conceal instead of express. And the shame doesn't just live in your head. It lives in your body. You carry yourself smaller. You take up less space. You move through the world apologizing for existing in the shape you have. The cruelty is that body shame is often framed as motivation. If you hate your body enough, you'll change it. But shame doesn't create change. It creates paralysis. You're too ashamed to go to the gym because people will see you. Too ashamed to eat in public. Too ashamed to exist fully in the body you have while you work toward the body you want. The shame doesn't push you forward. It traps you. And body shame intersects with everything. Gender, race, class, disability. The standards aren't neutral. They're built around a narrow set of acceptable bodies. And if yours doesn't fit, the message is clear: you're the problem, not the standard. You. Breaking body shame doesn't mean pretending you love everything about your body. It means separating your worth from your appearance. Recognizing that your body is a vessel, not a measure. That it allows you to move, feel, connect, experience. And that its value isn't determined by how it looks. It's determined by what it lets you do. And who you are inside it, which has nothing to do with size, shape, or how well you meet someone else's standard. Sexual shame. Someone asks about your past. A simple question. But the answer feels dangerous. Not because it's scandalous. Because it reveals something you've learned to keep hidden. Your desires. Your history. The parts of your sexuality that don't fit the acceptable script. Sexual shame isn't about guilt over specific actions. It's deeper. It's the belief that your sexual self is inherently wrong. Dirty. Something to be concealed. It gets planted early. Through silence. Through jokes that land like judgments. Through the message that sex is fine as long as it looks a certain way. Certain acts. Certain partners. Certain contexts. Step outside those lines and the shame kicks in. Not just, I shouldn't have done that, but there's something wrong with me for wanting it. And sexual shame doesn't stay in the bedroom. It shapes how you move through the world. You monitor what you reveal. You edit your expressions of attraction. You present a sanitized version of yourself because the real version, the one with complicated desires and messy history, feels too risky to show. The damage is in the isolation. Sexual shame thrives in silence. You can't talk about it because talking about it means exposing the thing you're ashamed of. So you carry it alone. And the secrecy confirms the shame. If it were acceptable, you could speak it. Since you can't, it must be proof that something's wrong. Sexual shame also distorts intimacy. You can't be fully present if part of you is hidden. You can't connect deeply if you're performing acceptability instead of revealing truth. So relationships stay surface level. Not because you don't want closeness, because the shame won't let you risk it. And breaking sexual shame doesn't mean oversharing. It means recognizing that your sexuality, in whatever form it takes, isn't evidence of defect. It's part of being human. Messy, complex, varied. And the shame you've been carrying isn't protecting you. It's keeping you small, keeping you silent, and keeping you from the connection you actually want. Failure shame. The project fails. You tried. You worked hard. But it didn't land. And instead of thinking, that didn't work, you think, I'm not good enough. The failure isn't about the outcome. It's about you. Failure shame takes a situational event and globalizes it. One failed attempt becomes proof of inadequacy. One rejection becomes evidence you don't have what it takes. The specific loss doesn't stay specific. It expands until it's a statement about your worth. Where does it come from? Environments where failure wasn't allowed. Where mistakes were treated as moral failings instead of learning opportunities. Where love and approval were conditional on success. You learn that failing at something means failing as someone. And that lesson doesn't leave easily. So you avoid. You don't try things you might fail at. You stay in safe territory where success is guaranteed. You shrink your ambitions to fit what you know you can achieve. Not because you lack drive. Because the cost of failing, of confirming what you secretly believe about yourself, feels unbearable. and the avoidance creates a trap. The less you risk, the less you grow. The less you grow, the more evidence you have that you're not capable. The shame doesn't just prevent failure. It prevents the success that might disprove it. Failure shame also makes you catastrophize. A minor setback becomes a crisis. A delayed timeline becomes proof the whole thing is doomed. Because when failure threatens your identity, every stumble feels like the beginning of collapse. You can't see obstacles as normal. They're signs you were never supposed to succeed in the first place. The way out isn't eliminating failure. It's separating failure from self. Recognizing that failing at something doesn't make you a failure. That trying and missing is still better than not trying at all. That competence is built through repeated attempts, most of which don't work. But as long as failure feels like proof you're broken, you'll keep playing it safe. And safety, when it's built on fear, isn't safety at all. It's just a slower kind of shrinking. Identity shame. You're part of a group. It's not something you chose. Your race, your background, your sexuality, your disability. And somewhere along the way, you absorb the message that this part of you is less than. Not explicitly, just through 1,000 small signals that your normal is someone else's deviation. This is identity shame. Shame not for what you've done, but for what you are. It's different from other forms of shame because you can't fix it. Guilt points to behavior you can change. Identity shame points to something fundamental. You can't apologize your way out of your identity. You can't modify it to fit. It just is. And the shame says that's the problem. Identity shame shows up in how you present yourself. You minimize the parts that mark you as different. You code switch. You adjust your appearance, your speech, your behavior to pass, to blend, to avoid triggering the judgment you've internalized, not because you want to hide. Because you've learned that visibility comes with a cost. And it's exhausting. You're constantly managing perception, calculating which parts of yourself are safe to show and which need to stay concealed. The energy it takes to perform acceptability drains the energy you'd use to just exist. And over time, the performance becomes so automatic you forget what's real and what's for show. Identity shame also creates internal division. Part of you is proud, connected to your identity, rooted in your community. But another part has absorbed the shame. The bias. The message that you're acceptable only to the extent that you minimize what makes you different. And those two parts are constantly at war. Pride versus shame. Visibility versus safety. Authenticity versus acceptance. Breaking identity shame doesn't happen through individual willpower. It's structural. It requires pushing back against the systems that create it. But on a personal level, it starts with refusal. Refusing to shrink. Refusing to edit yourself into palatability. Refusing to treat your existence as something that needs justification. Because the shame isn't about you. It's about the world that told you being yourself was a problem. And that's not your burden to carry. Stigma consciousness. You're in a meeting. Someone makes a comment. It's not about you. Not directly. But it's about people like you. Your demographic. Your condition. Your background. And you feel it. Not just the comment. The awareness that everyone in the room might be thinking the same thing. And wondering if you fit the stereotype. This is stigma consciousness. The constant awareness that you belong to a group that's devalued. And that awareness shapes how you move through the world. It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. You've seen how people react when they find out. The shift in tone. The lowered expectations. The assumptions. So you've learned to anticipate it. To brace for it. To manage it before it even surfaces. And stigma consciousness is draining. You're hypervigilant. Always scanning for signs of judgment. Always calculating whether to disclose or conceal. always wondering if the neutral treatment you're getting would turn cold if they knew. The vigilance isn't optional. It's survival. But it takes energy you'd rather spend on anything else. Stigma consciousness also creates a double bind. If you succeed, it's despite your identity, an exception. If you fail, it confirms the stereotype. You can't just perform. You have to represent. Every action carries extra weight because it's being interpreted through the lens of the stigma. And that pressure is constant. It also distorts interpretation. When someone treats you poorly, you can't know if it's personal or prejudice. When you're passed over for an opportunity, you can't know if it's merit or bias. The ambiguity is maddening, because you can't address what you can't name, and naming it risks being dismissed as oversensitive. The insidious part is that stigma consciousness can become self-fulfilling. The anxiety about being judged affects performance. The hypervigilance drains cognitive resources. The constant management of perception keeps you from being fully present. And then the outcomes align with the stereotype. Not because the stereotype was true, but because the weight of carrying it made it harder to succeed. Internalized stigma. You've heard the stereotypes about your group, the assumptions, the judgments. And somewhere along the way, you stopped just being aware of them. You started believing them. Not about others in your group, about yourself. This is internalized stigma, when the external judgment becomes internal conviction. It's not conscious. You don't wake up deciding to believe you're less capable, less worthy, less deserving. But the messages are constant, and repetition has weight. Over time, the external narrative becomes your internal voice. You start seeing yourself through the lens of the stigma, and treating yourself accordingly. Internalized stigma shows up as self-sabotage. You don't apply for the job because you assume you won't get it. You don't speak up because you assume your perspective isn't valuable. You hold yourself to lower standards because you've internalized the belief that people like you can't achieve more. The limitation isn't external. You've made it internal, and it's isolating. You distance yourself from others in your group, not because you don't identify with them, but because being associated with them reinforces the stigma. You try to be the exception, the one who's different, the one who proves the stereotype wrong by distancing yourself from everyone it applies to. But that distance doesn't protect you. It just makes you complicit in your own marginalization. Internalized stigma also blocks support. You don't reach out to your community because you've absorbed the shame. You don't seek help because needing it feels like confirmation. You isolate because connection would mean acknowledging the identity you've learned to reject. And the isolation compounds the stigma. You're carrying it alone, with no one to challenge it. No one to remind you it was never true. Breaking internalized stigma requires recognizing where the voice is coming from. It's not your truth. It's borrowed, learned, absorbed from a system designed to make you doubt yourself. And the shame you feel isn't about your identity. It's about what you've been taught to believe about it. The work isn't changing who you are. It's unlearning what you've been told. Face threat. Someone challenges you in public. They question your competence, your judgment, your authority. It's not violent. Just a disagreement, but it doesn't feel minor. It feels like an attack. Because it's not just about the argument. It's about your standing, your reputation, the image you've carefully built. This is face threat. The risk of losing social standing through public exposure or challenge. Face isn't vanity. It's currency. It's how you're perceived, how you're respected, how much social capital you hold. And when someone threatens it, the stakes feel enormous. Because losing face doesn't just mean losing an argument. It means losing the position, the credibility, the influence that face provides. Face threat is especially acute in cultures that prioritize social harmony and hierarchy, where how you're seen matters as much as what you do, where reputation is built slowly and lost quickly. In those contexts, face isn't optional. It's survival. And anything that threatens it triggers a defensive response. The response to face threat is often escalation. You can't let the challenge go unanswered because silence looks like concession. So you push back. You defend. You assert. Not because the issue itself matters that much, but because backing down means losing face. And once lost, it's hard to recover. But face threat also creates rigidity. You can't admit mistakes because mistakes threaten face. You can't show vulnerability because vulnerability signals weakness. You can't change your position because changing looks like you were wrong. So you double down. You defend the indefensible. You maintain the image even when the cost of maintaining it is higher than the cost of letting it go. Face threat also blocks growth. Learning requires admitting you don't know. Improving requires acknowledging you were wrong. Connecting requires showing the parts of yourself that aren't polished. But if all of that threatens face, you can't do it. So you stay stuck, performing competence, defending turf, protecting an image that's become more important than the person behind it. Loss of face. The mistake is public, not catastrophic, not career-ending. But everyone saw it, your colleagues, your boss, the client. And now you can't undo it, can't take it back, can't pretend it didn't happen. The exposure is complete. And with it, something else slips away. Your credibility, your authority, the respect you spent years building. Loss of face isn't just embarrassment. It's social demotion, a measurable drop in how you're perceived. And in environments where hierarchy and reputation matter, that drop has consequences. Face operates like capital. You accumulate it through competence, reliability, discretion. You spend it when you need to assert authority or ask for trust. And you lose it through visible failure, public contradiction, or being caught in a lie. Once lost, it's not easily restored, because the people who witnessed the loss remember. The mechanics are social. When you lose face, others recalibrate. They treat you differently. Your opinions carry less weight. Your requests get more scrutiny. Your authority diminishes. Not because you've changed, because their perception of you has. And in collective cultures, where social standing is tightly linked to effectiveness, that shift can be devastating. Loss of face also triggers intense shame, because it's not private. You can't manage the narrative. Everyone knows. And the knowledge is shared. They saw you fail. They saw you exposed. And now, every interaction carries the memory of that moment. The response is often withdrawal. You avoid the people who witnessed the loss. You stay quiet in meetings. You don't assert yourself because assertion requires face and yours is depleted. You become smaller. Not because you want to. Because the social cost of visibility feels too high. But withdrawal compounds the problem. The less visible you are, the less opportunity you have to rebuild. Face is restored through consistent, visible competence. Through reclaiming authority in small ways. Through proving the loss was an exception, not a pattern. But if you're hiding, you can't do that. So the loss becomes permanent. And the demotion you feared becomes the reality you create. Self-disgust. You look at yourself in the mirror, not just your appearance, your actions, your choices, your patterns. And the feeling that surfaces isn't disappointment or regret. It's revulsion, a visceral reaction to who you've become. Like you've crossed a line you can't uncross. And now you have to live with what's on the other side. Self-disgust is deeper than shame. Shame says, I did something wrong. Disgust says, I'm contaminated. Disgust is a protective mechanism. It evolved to keep you away from things that could harm you. Spoiled food. Disease. Danger. It's a physical recoil, a rejection response. And when it turns inward, it treats the self like the threat. Self-disgust often emerges after a moral violation. You did something that clashes with your values. Hurt someone. Lied. Betrayed trust. And the action feels so incompatible with you thought you were that your brain categorizes you as wrong, spoiled, something to be rejected. But self-disgust doesn't stay contained. It generalizes. One action becomes proof of a corrupted core. You don't just hate what you did. You hate yourself for being capable of it. And that hatred doesn't motivate change. It motivates avoidance. You can't face yourself, can't examine the behavior because examining it means acknowledging it's yours. Self-disgust also shows up around the body. Eating disorders. Sexual shame. Chronic illness. Anywhere the body becomes the source of revulsion. The mechanics are the same. The body feels wrong, contaminated, and the response is rejection. You starve it. Punish it. Refuse to inhabit it fully because doing so feels unbearable. Breaking self-disgust requires separating the action from the self. Recognizing that doing something you regret doesn't make you irredeemable. That being human means being flawed. That mistakes, even serious ones, don't contaminate your core. But when disgust has taken hold, that separation feels impossible. Because disgust doesn't argue, it recoils. And as long as you're recoiling from yourself, there's no path forward. Moral shame. You acted on self-interest. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even particularly unusual. But it violated your internal code. The principle you thought you lived by. And now you're left with the knowledge that when it mattered, you chose yourself. And that choice feels like a betrayal. Moral shame isn't about breaking society's rules. It's about breaking your own. Everyone has a moral framework. The lines they won't cross. The values they hold as non-negotiable. And moral shame surfaces when you cross one. Not because someone else told you to, but because you know internally that you acted against what you believe. The content varies. For some, it's honesty. You lied when integrity mattered. For others, it's loyalty. You abandoned someone who needed you. For others, it's fairness. You took advantage when you could have shared. The specifics don't matter as much as the violation. You know you failed the standard you set for yourself. And moral shame is isolating. You can't blame the system. Can't point to external pressure. The failure was internal. You had a choice, and you chose wrong. That makes it harder to forgive, because there's no one else to hold accountable. Moral shame also damages self-trust. If you can't rely on yourself to act in alignment with your values, what can you rely on? The doubt creeps in. I thought I was the kind of person who would do the right thing. But I'm not, and that realization doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes. Because your sense of identity is built on those values. And if you don't live by them, who are you? The response is often overcompensation. You double down on the value you violated. You become rigid, punitive. Not because it helps, but because the rigidity feels like proof you've corrected, that you won't fail again. But rigidity isn't the same as integrity. And moral shame resolved through self-punishment doesn't actually heal. It just keeps the wound open. Image management anxiety. Every post is a calculation. Does this make me look smart, successful, relatable? Too much, not enough. You draft, delete, redraft, adjust the caption, change the photo. And even after it's posted, the monitoring doesn't stop. You check the likes, the comments, the absence of response, each one a data point in how you're being perceived. Image management anxiety isn't about caring how you look. It's about needing to control it. Constantly. Social media amplified it. But the anxiety existed before. It's the fear that if people see the unfiltered version, The one that's struggling or uncertain or less than impressive, they'll reject you. So you cure it. You present the best angles, the highlight reel, the version that's most likely to earn approval. And the curation is exhausting. Because you're not just managing one image, you're managing multiple. The professional you, the social you, the partner you. Each context requires a different performance. And switching between them, keeping them consistent, making sure none of them reveal too much, drains energy you'd rather spend elsewhere. Image management anxiety also creates disconnection. You're so focused on how you're being perceived that you lose track of how you actually feel. You choose activities based on how they'll look, not whether you want to do them. You share moments not to preserve memory but to signal status. And the life you're presenting starts to feel more real than the life you're living. The irony is that the more you manage your image, the more fragile it becomes. Because it's not rooted in anything real. It's a performance. And performances require maintenance. One slip, one moment where the real you leaks through, and the whole construction feels at risk. So you tighten control. And the anxiety compounds. Breaking image management anxiety means accepting that you can't control perception. People will see you however they see you. And trying to force a specific image doesn't create connection. It creates performance fatigue. And the approval you get for the curated version doesn't satisfy. Because deep down, you know it's not really you they're approving. It's the image. And the real you stays hidden, still waiting to be seen. Spotlight effect. You trip on the sidewalk, not badly, just a stumble, but immediately you feel it. The weight of 1,000 eyes. Everyone saw. Everyone's judging. You replay the moment, convinced it's all anyone will remember about you today. Except they didn't. Most people didn't even notice. And the ones who did forgot within seconds. This is the spotlight effect. The illusion that you're being watched and evaluated far more than you actually are. It happens because you're the center of your own attention. You notice every awkward phrase, every imperfect gesture, every minor flaw. And because it's so vivid to you, you assume it's equally vivid to everyone else. But it's not. They're too busy being the centers of their own attention. Research demonstrates this clearly. People overestimate how much others notice their appearance, their mistakes, their embarrassing moments by a significant margin. You think your bad haircut is obvious. Your stutter is glaring. Your outfit is wrong. But most people aren't paying that much attention. They have their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own spotlights to manage. The spotlight effect makes social situations exhausting. You're hyper-aware of every move because you believe every move is being scrutinized. So you monitor, you adjust, you perform, not because people are actually watching that closely, but because you can't shake the feeling that they are. And the effect is self-reinforcing. The more you believe you're being watched, the more self-conscious you become. The more self-conscious you are, the more awkward you feel. And the more awkward you feel, the more certain you are that everyone noticed. But the attention you're imagining isn't real. You've created an audience that doesn't exist. And you're performing for it anyway. The antidote is recognizing the asymmetry. You remember your own embarrassing moments vividly. But can you recall the last time someone else stumbled, stuttered, wore the wrong thing? Probably not. Because you weren't paying attention. And neither are they. The spotlight you feel isn't shining as brightly as you think. Most of the time, it's not on at all. Blushing response. Your face heats. You feel it spreading. Neck, cheeks, ears. And the more you feel it, the worse it gets. Because now you're not just embarrassed about the thing that triggered it. You're embarrassed about being visibly embarrassed. And everyone can see it. Blushing is involuntary. a physiological response to self-conscious emotions, embarrassment, shame, being caught in a lie. The body floods the face with blood, and the result is unmistakable. You can't hide it, can't control it. And that lack of control makes it worse. Why does it happen? One theory is that blushing is an apology signal, a nonverbal way of communicating, I know I messed up. I feel bad about it. It's a social repair mechanism. The visible flush shows remorse, which can soften others' judgment. In that sense, blushing isn't a flaw. It's a feature, a way to signal accountability without words. But for people who blush easily, the mechanism feels more like a curse, because it doesn't just activate during genuine transgressions. It activates when you're the center of attention, when someone compliments you, when you're called on in a meeting. The blush isn't proportional to the situation. It's just there, announcing to everyone that you're uncomfortable. And the awareness creates a feedback loop. You feel the heat rising. You know others can see it. That knowledge intensifies the self-consciousness, which makes the blush worse, which increases the embarrassment, until you're caught in a cycle where the response itself becomes the problem. Blush-prone people develop strategies. They avoid situations where they might be the focus. They prepare obsessively to reduce the chance of being caught off guard. They wear makeup or clothing that conceals the flush, not because they want to hide, because the alternative, being visibly exposed every time they feel self-conscious, is unbearable. But blushing isn't the enemy. It's a signal that you care. That social dynamics matter to you. That being seen in a negative light feels significant. And while it's uncomfortable, it's also deeply human. The real problem isn't the blush. It's the shame about the blush, the belief that showing vulnerability, even involuntarily, is something to be hidden. And that belief keeps the cycle going. Self-discrepancy. There's who you are, and there's who you think you should be. The gap between them isn't just distance, it's tension. A constant pull that says you're not measuring up, not achieving enough, not becoming the person you're supposed to be. Self-discrepancy is the space between your actual self and your ideal self. And that space, when it's wide enough, becomes a source of chronic dissatisfaction. Everyone has an ideal. The version of yourself you'd be if everything aligned. More confident, more successful, more disciplined, more present. The specifics vary, but the pattern is the same. You hold an image of who you could be. And every day you're reminded of how far you are from reaching it. The discrepancy creates motivation when it's manageable. A small gap says, I can close this. I can get there. It pushes you to grow, to improve, to take steps toward the person you want to become. The tension is productive. But when the gap is too wide, motivation turns into despair. You can't see a path. The ideal feels unreachable. And instead of pushing you forward, the discrepancy pins you in place. Why try when the distance is insurmountable? Self-discrepancy also fuels comparison. You measure yourself against others who seem closer to the ideal, who appear to have it together, who've achieved what you haven't. And every comparison widens the gap, not because you've regressed, but because the ideal keeps shifting further away. The cruelty is that the ideal is often constructed from fragments, the best parts of different people, the highlights, the achievements, the moments where everything clicked. You're comparing your full reality to an impossible composite. And that comparison guarantees you'll always fall short. Closing the discrepancy doesn't mean reaching the ideal. It means revising it. Recognizing that the version of yourself you're chasing isn't just distant. It's fictional. Built from expectations that were never yours to begin with. And the real work isn't becoming that person. It's figuring out who you actually are. And whether that's enough. Ideal self-discrepancy. You want to be generous, kind, The person who always shows up for others. But when the call comes, when someone needs you, you hesitate. You're tired. You have your own problems. And you say no. And immediately the guilt lands. Because the person you want to be wouldn't hesitate. Ideal self-discrepancy is the gap between who you wish you were and who you actually are. And that gap breeds disappointment. The ideal self isn't realistic. It's aspirational. The best version of you. The one who's always patient, always motivated, always doing the right thing. It's who you'd be if circumstances were perfect and willpower was infinite. But circumstances aren't perfect, and willpower runs out. So you fall short. You lose your temper when you wanted to stay calm. You procrastinate when you meant to be productive. You stay home when you intended to go out. And each failure feels personal. Because it's not just a missed action. It's proof you're not the person you're trying to become. Ideal self-discrepancy is tied to what psychologists call dejection-related emotions. Sadness, disappointment, a sense of loss. Because you're mourning the version of yourself that isn't showing up. The one who would have handled this better. And the discrepancy grows when you set the ideal too high. If your standard is perfection, every human mistake becomes evidence of failure. You can't rest without feeling lazy. Can't set boundaries without feeling selfish. Can't stumble without feeling inadequate. The ideal becomes a weapon. And you're the one wielding it. But ideals aren't meant to be wreaked. They're meant to guide. They show direction, not destination. The person you want to be isn't a fixed point. It's a process. And the gap between here and there isn't failure. It's the space where growth happens. As long as you're moving, the discrepancy isn't a problem. It's proof you're still reaching. Ought self-discrepancy. Your parents had expectations. Your culture had standards. Your community had rules. And you've absorbed them. Not as suggestions. As obligations. Things you're supposed to do. Ways you're supposed to be. And when you don't meet them, it's not just disappointment. It's guilt. Ought self-discrepancy is the gap between who you think you should be and who you are. And that gap is built on duty. The ought self is different from the ideal self. The ideal is what you want for yourself. The ought is what others expect. It's the career path your family approved. The relationship timeline society prescribed. The lifestyle your community values. And when you deviate, the judgment isn't just internal. It's external too. Ought self-discrepancy creates agitation-related emotions. Anxiety. Guilt. Fear. Because you're not just falling short of your own standards. You're failing to meet the expectations of people who matter. And that failure comes with social consequences. Disapproval. Disappointment. Distance. The weight of the ought self is heavy because it's not negotiable. You can revise your ideal, lower your expectations, adjust your goals, but the ought feels fixed. It's what you're supposed to do. And if you're not doing it, you're in the wrong. Ought self-discrepancy also creates resentment. Because the life you're supposed to live isn't the life you want. You're pursuing someone else's vision, following someone else's script. And even if you succeed, the success doesn't feel like yours. You've met the obligation, but you've lost yourself in the process. Breaking free from ought self-discrepancy means separating expectation from identity. Recognizing that what you're supposed to be isn't the same as what you are, or what you want to become. And that the guilt you feel for not meeting those expectations isn't proof you're failing. It's proof you're making different choices. Choices that might disappoint others, but choices that are yours. Perfectionistic self-criticism. You finish the project. It's good, maybe even great, but all you see are the flaws. The sentence that could have been stronger, the detail you missed, the way it doesn't quite match the vision you had in your head. And instead of celebrating the accomplishment, you catalogue the failures. Perfectionistic self-criticism doesn't acknowledge good enough. It only sees the gap between actual and flawless. Perfectionists aren't trying to do well. They're trying to do perfectly, and perfect is impossible. So every outcome, no matter how strong, carries the residue of what it isn't. The version that would have been better. The standard that wasn't quite met. And the criticism is relentless. You don't just evaluate the work, you evaluate yourself. I should have done better. I should have seen that. I should have worked harder. The failure of the work becomes a failure of character. You're not just imperfect, you're inadequate. Perfectionistic self-criticism also blocks progress. Because if the standard is perfection, starting feels dangerous. What if you can't reach it? What if the work reveals that you're not as capable as you need to be? So you delay. You overplan. You research endlessly. Not because you need more preparation, because starting means facing the possibility that you won't be perfect. And that possibility is unbearable. The irony is that perfectionistic self-criticism doesn't create better work. It creates paralysis and exhaustion. And a version of yourself that's so focused on avoiding flaws that you've stopped taking risks. Because risks mean mistakes. And mistakes in the perfectionist's framework are proof you're not good enough. But mistakes aren't failure. They're feedback. The work you produce isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a snapshot of where you are right now. And where you are right now is always imperfect. That's not a flaw. It's the condition of being human. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can stop criticizing and start creating. Compassion collapse towards self. A friend calls. They're struggling. They made a mistake. They're beating themselves up. And you step in. You remind them it's okay. That everyone messes up. That one failure doesn't define them. You're patient. You're kind. You offer exactly the compassion they need. Then you make the same mistake, and the compassion disappears, replaced by a voice that's harsh, unforgiving, relentless. You don't deserve the grace you just gave them. You should have known better. This is compassion collapse towards self, the ability to extend understanding to others while withholding it from yourself. The pattern is consistent. You can rationalize someone else's struggle, see the context. Recognize the factors outside their control. But when it's yours, those factors don't matter. You strip away the nuance. Hold yourself to a standard you'd never apply to anyone else. And punish yourself for falling short. Where does it come from? Often early messages that your needs don't matter as much as others. That taking care of yourself is selfish. That you're supposed to be strong enough to handle things without requiring the softness you give away. So you learn to ration compassion. And when the supply is limited, you direct it outward, because others deserve it, and you don't. Compassion collapse creates a double standard. You forgive others. You hold yourself accountable. You see their humanity. You see your own failures. And the gap between how you treat them and how you treat yourself becomes the norm. You don't even notice it anymore. It's just how things work. But that double standard has a cost. You exhaust yourself trying to meet standards no one could meet. You carry shame for things that don't warrant it, and you deny yourself the very thing you'd freely offer anyone else. Not because you're strong, because you've been taught that you're not worth the care you give. Breaking compassion collapse means extending inward the same understanding you extend outward. Recognizing that you're as deserving of patience as anyone you love. That your mistakes are as forgivable as theirs. And that the voice telling you otherwise isn't truth. It's training. And it's time to retrain. Contingent self-worth. You get the promotion. For a few days you feel good, valuable, proof that you're doing something right. Then the feeling fades, and you're back to baseline, uncertain, waiting for the next achievement to confirm you're okay. Contingent self-worth is when your value is tied to external outcomes. You're only as good as your last success. Everyone experiences this to some degree. Achievements feel good. Failures feel bad. But for people with highly contingent self-worth, the stakes are different. Success isn't just satisfying. It's necessary. Without it, the foundation crumbles. You're not just disappointed. You're worthless. The contingency can attach to anything: performance, appearance, approval, relationships. Whatever the domain, the logic is the same. When you succeed, you're acceptable. When you fail, you're not. There's no stable core. Just a constant need to prove yourself, again and again. And the validation never lasts. Because it's external, you can't internalize it. You can't say, "I did well, so I'm capable." You say, "I did well this time." But what about next time? The worth is always provisional, always at risk, always dependent on circumstances you can't fully control. Contingent self-worth also makes failure catastrophic, because it's not just a setback. It's confirmation of what you feared. That without the achievement, the approval, the success, you're nothing. So you avoid risk. You stay in domains where success is guaranteed. You curate your life around maintaining the conditions that keep your worth intact. And the life you build becomes smaller. The alternative is unconditional self-worth. Worth that exists independent of outcomes. That doesn't rise and fall with achievements. That's there whether you succeed or fail. It's not arrogance. It's stability. And it's built not by doing more, but by recognizing that your value isn't something you earn. It's something you have. Just by being here. Secondhand shame. You're watching a movie. The character does something cringeworthy. Says the wrong thing at the worst moment. Misreads the situation completely. And you have to look away. Cover your face. Pause the screen. Not because it's happening to you. Because watching someone else experience it is unbearable. Secondhand shame is feeling embarrassment for someone else's actions, even when you're just an observer. It happens because empathy doesn't always stay contained. When you watch someone violate a social norm, your brain simulates the experience. Mirror neurons fire. You feel what they should be feeling. What you would feel if you were in their position. And that feeling is intense enough to make you recoil. The intensity varies with identification. If the person is similar to you, close to your age, your background, your social sphere, the mirroring strengthens. You can imagine yourself in that situation too easily. The boundary between their embarrassment and your own thins. And suddenly, you're not just watching. You're experiencing it secondhand. Secondhand shame is especially strong when the person doesn't realize they're embarrassing themselves. They're oblivious, confident, completely unaware that they've crossed a line. And that obliviousness makes it worse, because you can see the social fallout they can't. You know how this looks, how it will be remembered. And they don't. Reality television thrives on this. Talent shows where contestants are delusional. Interviews where people overshare. Moments designed to make the audience cringe. The format works because secondhand shame is a powerful hook. You can't look away, even though watching is uncomfortable, because the discomfort is the point. But secondhand shame isn't cruelty. It's social learning. Your brain is cataloging the mistake, filing it under things to avoid. The discomfort you feel watching someone else is insurance against doing the same thing yourself. It's a preview of consequences, a warning, and your nervous system treats it like it's real. Apology motivation. Some apologies are about repair. You hurt someone. You recognize it, and you want to make it right. The apology is genuine, focused on the other person, on acknowledging harm and committing to change. Other apologies are about relief. You feel guilty, and you want the feeling to stop. So you apologize. Not because you fully grasped the harm, but because saying sorry makes the discomfort go away. The apology is for you, not them. Apology motivation is the why behind the words, and the why determines whether the apology lands. Genuine apologies are other-focused. They start with acknowledging the specific harm, not vague, not generic. Specific. I said this. It hurt you. I see that now. Then they move to accountability. No excuses. No justifications. Just ownership. I was wrong. And they end with commitment. I'll do better. Here's how. Arc. Relief-focused apologies skip the hard parts. They jump straight to, I'm sorry, without unpacking what they're sorry for. They add caveats. I'm sorry, but you also. They center their own discomfort. I feel terrible about this. The focus shifts from the harm done to the guilt being carried. And that shift changes everything. The difference shows in what happens after. Genuine apologies create space for the other person to respond, to express how they feel, to decide whether they're ready to move forward. Relief-focused apologies demand immediate forgiveness. I said I'm sorry. What more do you want? The apology becomes a transaction, and the hurt person is expected to close the deal. Apology motivation also reveals itself in repetition. If you keep apologizing for the same behavior, the motivation is suspect. Because genuine apologies come with changed actions. You don't just say you'll do better. You do better. Relief-focused apologies are performative. They manage the guilt in the moment. But they don't prevent the harm from recurring. Recognizing your own apology motivation is uncomfortable, because most people believe their apologies are genuine. But if you're apologizing to feel better, not to repair, the other person can tell. And the apology, no matter how heartfelt it sounds, doesn't land. It just creates more distance. Restorative guilt. Guilt, when it works right, is a repair signal. It says, you violated a value. Fix it, and that signal drives action. You apologize. You make amends. You change your behavior. The guilt doesn't just sit there. It moves you toward restoration. Restorative guilt is productive. It's focused outward. On the person you hurt. On the relationship you damaged. On the principle you compromised. And it doesn't stop at feeling bad. It pushes toward making things right. The mechanics are straightforward. You recognize the harm. You feel the weight of it. And that weight becomes motivation. Not to wallow. To act. You reach out. You own what you did. You ask what repair looks like. And you follow through. The guilt doesn't dissolve immediately, but it shifts from a burden into a guide. Restorative guilt also prevents repetition, because the discomfort of causing harm is linked to the behavior that caused it. You don't want to feel this way again. So you adjust. You pay attention to the boundary you crossed. You build in safeguards. The guilt becomes a tikka, and the lesson sticks. But restorative guilt requires honesty. You have to actually want to repair, not just want the guilt to stop. If you're apologizing to ease your own discomfort, that's not restorative. That's avoidance. Restorative guilt stays uncomfortable until the repair is made. It doesn't let you off the hook early. It holds you accountable. The contrast is with guilt that spirals. Guilt that turns inward. That focuses on how bad you feel instead of what you can do. That guilt doesn't restore anything. It just drains. Restorative guilt, by contrast, has a direction, a purpose. It doesn't ask, how do I stop feeling this way? It asks, how do I make this right? And that question has answers. Defensive shame avoidance. Shame hurts. So you avoid it. Not by changing the behavior that triggers it. By refusing to acknowledge it at all. Someone points out a mistake. You deflect. Minimize. Shift blame. anything to keep from feeling that sharp edge of exposure. Defensive shame avoidance is the reflex to protect yourself from shame by denying the thing that caused it. It shows up as defensiveness. Someone gives feedback, and instead of considering it, you argue. That's not what happened. You're misunderstanding. You're being too sensitive. The response isn't about accuracy. It's about defense. Because accepting the feedback means accepting you were wrong. And wrong feels too close to worthless. Defensive shame avoidance also shows up as blame shifting. You did something hurtful. But instead of owning it, you point to what they did. I wouldn't have said that if you hadn't. The logic is clear. If they're partly responsible, you're not fully at fault. And if you're not fully at fault, the shame doesn't land as hard. Another form is rationalization. You construct a narrative where your actions were justified, necessary, the only option available. Not because that's true, but because believing it protects you from the discomfort of having acted against your values. The rationalization doesn't hold up under scrutiny, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to create enough distance between you and the shame. The cost of defensive shame avoidance is growth, because growth requires acknowledging where you're falling short. And if you can't tolerate that acknowledgement, you can't change. You stay stuck, repeating the same patterns, hurting the same people, wondering why nothing improves. But the answer is simple. You're protecting yourself from the very feedback that could help you grow. Breaking defensive shame avoidance means sitting with discomfort, letting the shame surface without immediately defending against it. Recognizing that being wrong doesn't make you worthless, that mistakes are part of being human, and that the people offering feedback aren't attacking you. They're giving you information you can use, if you stop defending long enough to hear it. Moral cleansing. You did something you regret, something that doesn't align with who you think you are, and the guilt sits heavy. So you do something good. Done it. Volunteer. Help someone. Not because you genuinely want to, but because the good action feels like it balances the bad one, like it cleans the slate. This is moral cleansing, the psychological urge to offset a moral violation with a moral action. It's not the same as making amends. Amends are directed. You harmed someone. You repair the harm with that person. Moral cleansing is diffuse. You harm someone. You help someone else. The two aren't connected. But helping feels like it cancels out the hurt. Like morality operates on a point system. And if you earn enough points elsewhere, the original violation doesn't count as much. Research shows this pattern consistently. People who are reminded of past unethical behavior are more likely to engage in prosocial actions immediately after. Not because they've reflected and changed, but because the good action reduces the psychological discomfort of the bad one. It's a shortcut. A way to feel better without actually addressing what went wrong. Moral cleansing also shows up in consumer behavior. You buy something unethical. Fast fashion. A product from a company with bad labor practices. And the guilt surfaces, so you buy something eco-friendly next, or donate to a cause. The second purchase doesn't undo the first, but it makes you feel less complicit, like you've balanced the scales. The problem with moral cleansing is that it doesn't change behavior. You don't stop doing the thing that caused guilt. You just add compensatory actions to manage the guilt. So the cycle continues. Harm, cleans, harm, cleans. And the original behavior never gets addressed. Real moral repair doesn't work like that. It's not about balancing. It's about stopping, recognizing the behavior that violated your values, and choosing not to do it again. That's harder, because it requires sacrifice, change, discomfort. But it's the only thing that actually works. Moral cleansing might make you feel better, but it doesn't make you better. Self-forgiveness struggle. You know what you did. You've acknowledged it. Apologized. Made amends where you could. The other person has moved on. But you haven't. You still replay it. Still feel the weight. Still punish yourself for something that's already been resolved. Self-forgiveness struggle is the inability to let go of guilt even after the harm has been repaired. It's not about denying responsibility. You're not minimizing what you did. You're holding yourself accountable. But the accountability has tipped into something else. Perpetual self-punishment. A refusal to grant yourself the same forgiveness you'd extend to anyone else. Where does it come from? Often, the belief that forgiveness has to be earned. And no matter how much you do, it never feels like enough. You've apologized. But that's just words. You've changed your behavior. But that's expected. You've carried the guilt for months. For years. But somehow, that still doesn't feel like sufficient penance. Self-forgiveness struggle also comes from identity. If you define yourself by your mistakes, forgiving yourself feels like erasing evidence of who you are. The guilt becomes part of your story. Proof that you're not the person who would do that again. And letting it go feels dangerous. Like without it, you might slip back into the behavior. But holding on to guilt doesn't prevent harm. It just keeps you stuck. You're so focused on the past that you can't be fully present. You're carrying weight that no longer serves anyone, not the person you hurt. They've moved on. Not you. It's just making you smaller. Self-forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the action was okay. It means recognizing that you've done the work. You've acknowledged the harm. You've made the repair. And continuing to punish yourself isn't accountability. It's self-destruction. And there's nothing noble about it. It's just another way of avoiding the harder task, accepting that you're human. Flawed. Capable of harm. And also capable of change. And that both things can be true.